We've got another panel here, and I'm really delighted today to have Amy France, the chair of National Sorghum Producers, Sean Arians, the Vice President of Sustainable Production and Value Chain Engagement with the National Corn Growers Association, Lindsay Fitzgerald, Chief Advocacy Officer for GIVO, and Greg Jaffe, President of Jaffe Policy Consulting. So, Amy, let's kick off with you. You didn't grow up on a farm, but you're married to a farmer, and you have a great operation. Talk to us just a little bit about the sorghum industry in general and how you're looking at both the association and the checkoff helping develop new uses.
Thank you, Sarah. As you said, I did not grow up in agriculture, so Tom, with United Airlines, we can still be huge advocates without being born and raised in that world. And I think actually I found myself in a unique position to almost be a translator, if you will, for the farmer to the hill or the agencies or the businesses. And so it really is an honor. And as I listen to these panels before me, and I'm like, you're talking about what's happening truly on my farm. Talk about the crunch, John Newton. I feel it. Getting ready for my renewal coming up next month and what that looks like. So I'm excited to be here and really grateful to be able to be here and bring a farmer's voice, because so many times I feel like we're driving policy or decisions and then we get there and we're like, but wait, can the farmers do this? And so at the end of the day, what we're thinking, sorghum and farmer, is this a long-term reliable source, and what will this do for our farm? So as Sarah said, I am chair of National Sorghum Producers, and it is an honor to represent my sorghum growers as well. And we're a small crop compared to some of the other commodity groups, and so we call ourselves pretty scrappy. So we're looking at all of the options, whether that is E15, that will take 2.5 billion additional bushels of sorghum straight into that vein, or if we're talking about human consumption, which is huge for us. And so really excited to have this conversation. It's top of priority. All of the options, all of the above is what sorghum producers think. How can we make the most out of this crop that we produce so incredibly well and help our farmers farm the next year?
Thanks, Amy. Sean, on to you. Tell us what NCGA is doing in the new uses area.
Thank you. And as we think about this, you heard about half of the portfolio on the previous panel, thinking about a little bit of the biofuels from E15, as Amy alluded to. We certainly believe that is something that should have been across the finish line, and look forward to that day coming soon. And then, of course, SAF and maritime are two other key areas that we're looking into. And the last one, though, that we're most interested in, because it is a huge sector across the world, and that's really the bioeconomy. And if we look at all of those, when we look at corn demand and corn utilization, as Amy kind of teed up both with sorghum and, frankly, all crops, we can't grow enough crops to supply SAF, maritime, and the bioeconomy and on-road fuels. The reality of it is there's a place at the table for all of us. And that's what's really exciting, is thinking about diversifying our crops, helping all farmers across the country and across the world as we think about these markets. So from a bioeconomy standpoint, when we look at just capturing simply 10% of that market, 10% would take between 3 and 4 billion bushels of corn to supply that bioeconomy. And think about replacing a fossil product with an ethanol drop-in replacement or a corn sugar or corn oil. That creates a lot of opportunity for us. And one of those examples is AirTerra, which is a corn-based air filter that happy to talk more about. But that's just one way that a corn-based product can impact 4 state economies and really drive into how do we become better at utilizing things we grow and as a renewable resource.
Thanks, Sean. Lindsay, you bring a little bit different perspective on value added and new uses, starting with soil and regenerative agriculture. Tell us about your perspective from GIVO.
Sure. So the GIVO perspective and how we think about things is the whole entire business ecosystem. So yes, we're producing renewable fuels and chemicals. We're also producing carbon abatement. And so we're thinking about this all the way back to the field. What is the farmer doing on the field that carries all the way through, that can reduce the carbon intensity of your fuel, your product, whatever it is, And as we're seeing growing markets around the world that are looking at and valuing carbon, there's a benefit and there's something that we can capture for the farmer that they're already doing. So we have a subsidiary, Verity, that will go out and work with farmers, meets them where they are to say, what's happening on your field? What practices are you doing? And how does that impact the carbon intensity score of the products that you're making? And then helping along the way to create additional value, whether it's through selling that attached to the fuel, like in an LCFS style program, or taking advantage of a voluntary market and splitting that fuel from that carbon and getting the most value for the carbon that also tracks its way back to the farmer.
Thank you. Greg, so you've been also involved in value added for a long time. I know you started very early. But from your role, even at USDA, where you were a senior advisor to the secretary looking at bioeconomy and regulatory affairs, talk to us a little bit about just the government's role in helping create new markets and build new markets.
So I think the government has a major role, and I think that role goes from the concept, what is the potential bio-based product that we're thinking about, all the way to the market demand for that product. And so, I might take us through that and just give you some examples. The U.S. government does a lot of funding and both intramural research on developing these products. Recently I went to the USDA Western Region Agricultural Research Service facility in Albany, California. And they are working on a number of different bio-based products. They work on bioplastics. They work on bio-based cleaning materials. They were working on guayuli, which is a desert shrub that they're turning into natural rubber. And what was interesting, and sort of is a little secret that a lot of people don't know, is in the basement of that building were about a half dozen companies that they're having public-private partnerships. So the scientists from the companies and the USDA ARS researchers are working together to develop those products to bring them to commercialization. I then went a few miles away in Emeryville to the Department of Energy, where they have the Berkeley National Lab. And they're doing a tremendous amount of research and development, again, in public-private partnerships. They have a room that Turks is working on biomass extraction. How do we extract the cellulose out of that biomass? They had a room on fermentation. How do they improve the fermentation of these products? They're working on microorganism strain development. How do they improve the strains of microorganisms that are being used in the fermentation? And they had a whole room working on downstream processing. And again, they're working with private industry side by side to help move ideas and concepts into practice. So I've just mentioned, two small agencies, but there's funding at the research and development level. Then we move to infrastructure. And whether it's the Department of Agriculture, whether it's Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, the Department of Commerce, they all have programs, grant programs, guaranteed loan programs, regional hub, technology hub programs, where they're funding consortiums of partners, public partners, private partners, universities, and others to build out the infrastructure that we need to develop these products. Remember, these products are competing a lot of times with legacy petroleum products that have an infrastructure, already have buildings, already have the facilities. And so that we need the government for support for that. The third area I might quickly mention is regulation and policy. And I know the panel before talked about 45Z and the USDA Climate Smart Ag Rule and some of the policies there that are really important to move the bioeconomy forward. But there's a host of other policies. So, as an example, USDA regulates microorganisms movement. And, microorganisms are the sort of the linchpin for a lot of the bioeconomy. And so you need a permit, and USDA deals with permits for movement of those. FDA deals with when you have precision fermentation and you're producing a food ingredient, whether that's a protein or something. FDA is going to regulate that. EPA regulates biostimulants. So we have microorganisms being developed to fix nitrogen. And so those are being developed. And so we need to make sure that those regulations are science-based, are transparent, and are streamlined so that these products can move forward as quickly as possible. And finally, I just might mention, getting to the market end, USDA has the Bio-Preferred program. That's both a voluntary labeling program and also a preference for for federal procurement in this area. We have to build that consumer demand for these products so that we can go all the way through the chain to get them to market.
Thanks, Greg. That's a great overview of involvement by the government. And I've got some questions here to ask, but this is also a great opportunity for you to ask these experts. So please get your Slido app out and make sure that you're sending in questions so that I can ask those of the audience as well. For now, I'm going to turn to Amy again and talk to her a little bit about food uses. You mentioned this. I honestly did not know until, it's probably been over a decade now, where I was introduced to Grainberry cereal, and it was pretty good. So what else are you working on in the space of food uses of sorghum?
So human consumption is really exciting for us, and what we see an uptick in. We've known for a while that there have been some health benefits, but we have just begun, speaking to research, some human health trials there at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So excited to see in print what we've already kind of known, heart health, those kind of things. So one thing that people often don't realize, and we have to kind of interject ourselves into, whether it's the ethanol conversation or whether it's the small grains conversation, sorghum is gluten-free. And so as we have heard that as a driving consumer need, that's been something that we've really been able to plug into: gluten-free, high protein, fiber, and a whole grain grown in the U.S. Those are all things that our consumers are wanting. So some things that we've seen just around the Super Bowl time, we had Cheez-Its, primarily using sorghum. And we all know a gluten-free Cheez-It is a pretty cool deal, and we're excited about that. You talked about breakfast, so 7 Sundays as a kind of a granola and a cereal. Sorghum's being used in that. Gerber baby snack foods. Sorghum's being used in that. We have just recently been brought into a collaboration for Cobb Foods, which is a world-renowned tennis player, is now partnered up with sorghum because they know these health benefits. In fact, he says that his longevity in the sport is all because of sorghum. And I will not dispute that, and I think it's great, and I believe it 100%. But that's something that we've really been focusing on is where can we utilize these other unknown strengths of sorghum. We've been used in pet food. Again, these are other people in our family, our pets are, and so that's been used. Aquaculture, as well as long time known in actual, poultry, pork, beef, those productions. But human consumption is something on the rise, and something that we use on a daily. We just cook it up in a mass quantity, meal prep, and then we add it to our cereals or our soups or our casseroles, salads. So something really exciting that we've seen an uptick in recently.
Thanks. Sean, you mentioned AirTerra already. Tell us a little bit more about that. I had to admit before our call, I hadn't known a lot about it, but it sounds like it's a really cool product that we all should be consuming in our homes. Go ahead.
Yeah, it is a neat product from the standpoint of it's an easy conversation, and easier to have conversation to have than what goes in the fuel tank, and we can dispute whether ethanol is an octane or an E15 blend. That's a conversation for another day. Whereas when we talk about today's air filters that we all buy for our homes are generally made with a petroleum-based fiber. And this product came out of what we call our Consider Corn Challenge, which is our states invest in this program to bring new uses to the market, where a new fledgling company can bring an idea and compete for an investment, not in equity, but surely a grant to help them get further or closer to commercialization. AirTerra was our most recent winner of that, and that really highlights that we can take, and we're no longer proof of concept. You know, Gregory kind of mentioned hey, there's a lot of time needed for research, and through some of our work over how does corn make it through the next 250 years, as we think about our birthday of America coming up this year. If you look at the timeline of ethanol, and thanks to RFA for putting this out on their website, 200 years ago was when ethanol was first used. we don't have 200 years to find the answer to all the above. We need to move quickly. So Airterra's proof of concept is done. It works. You can order it today. Check out our website. You can find a link to it. But it is a great way for consumers to replace a fossilized filter in their home with a plant-based product. And that's the excitement there. So as we look at the economic impact for that, roughly $470 billion of economic impact in the bioeconomy space, not just the air filter, but bioeconomy in general, and about 4 million jobs. I alluded to it, but Airterra has a production change in 4 states. That's 4 state economies that are impacted by one product. And as we think about trying to bring jobs back to rural America, to economies, to manufacturing jobs, those are all wins for all of us to keep what we grow here in the U.S. and make our smaller towns and communities thrive again. So I think there's just a lot of opportunity there. And maybe something to touch on a little bit later is certainly this is one part of the process, but as alluded to, there are some policy challenges outside of 45Z that we're certainly working on, from a national bioincentive policy for a credit to producers of bioproducts. Kind of goes along with what was referenced on the Buy American Cotton. There are a lot of opportunities that I think our government can help us in the policy and regulatory space. And as Lindsay alluded to, from a carbon standpoint, we absolutely have to pay attention to how American farmers and our practices are being graded on the domestic and global scale as it relates to carbon. Because, for instance, in the bioeconomy, biogenic carbon, according to EPA, does not get a better score than regular carbon throughout the production process. So there are plenty of opportunities for us to engage both as consumers in making decisions with our wallet, but also from a regulatory and policy side to help our policymakers understand the impacts to each of us and our communities that we come from and live in.
Well, I think that's a good segue over for Lindsay to talk about carbon, because you've mentioned that sometimes it's gotten a bad reputation, especially in some policy circles, depending on your affiliation. So talk to us about how we need to think about carbon differently.
Sure. So I'll start with saying carbon is not a bad word. I think we can mostly agree with that, but there are some in this space that when you start to talk about carbon intensity, reducing your carbon footprint, that's a bad thing. We shouldn't talk about that. There's an opportunity there, because I used this example last week. I was in Australia. We were talking about biofuels policy and low carbon fuels policy. You have a kernel of corn. Most people think, great, got a kernel of corn, I'm going to sell it. You heard Devin up here earlier say, well, actually, there's 3 to 4 parts of that corn. There's all different things. There's also a carbon value to that. And so when you start to think about there's 3, 4, 5 different pieces of this one commodity, that's a big deal when you're looking at how do you stabilize in global markets. We're seeing around the world this focus move from volumetric, where we had an RFS, to focusing on carbon intensity. Great, we have infrastructure, we've got volume here. Now, how do we evolve and how do we do better? That's where the carbon accounting comes in. But to your point, what carbon counts here might not count over there. And it's something that GIVO and I know many others in this space are actively out there advocating around. You have to count all the carbon, because just because you don't like what I'm doing in my backyard, I can grow really great tomatoes in my backyard. Someone else, they may not be able to do that. Does that mean that I should be punished for what I can grow really well? Absolutely not. It just means that everybody needs to have a counting all of the carbon sort of methodology in place, and they are out there, that doesn't discount what anyone is doing.
Super. So, Greg, and thank you. Some of the questions are starting to come in here, so I'm glad those are populating. We'll turn to those next. But, Greg, one more for you. Talk about just some of the broad economic benefits of developing these new uses, and products like soy foam and others that you have shared are very promising in the pipeline.
Yes, thanks. So I think there are a lot of benefits to bio-based products and the bioeconomy. I think there are benefits to farmers. from new streams of income from the same crops or from the same land that they're using. So it increases their sustainability of their farmer operations. There's economic opportunities to rural communities, whether that's new jobs, whether it's new biomanufacturing facilities that are in their communities, because biomass generally is heavy. You can't transport it too far, so you're going to build those jobs where you're growing those crops. We have resilient supply chains. If we can produce things here in the U.S., produce them domestically, that helps. I think we heard about fertilizer. There's lots of great work being done to produce domestic fertilizer and produce it using bio-based biomass and bio-based materials. And then, of course, we've got, general sustainability or environmental benefits that we get from these products. So, if we're producing bioplastics from corn instead of from petroleum, we reduce the number of microplastics. We reduce many of those products are compostable, so we have less environmental waste for those. If we're using biofuels, we have less toxic air pollutants that are getting in the air for human health. Biostimulants using biofertilizers, we're reducing the amount of nitrogen that may be on the land and getting into our waterways. So those are benefits. And, finally, the benefit I'd mention also is, the bioeconomy is moving forward. Countries around the world are doing biotechnology and biomanufacturing, and we have a choice of either engaging in that and continuing to be a leader in biotechnology and moving forward in biomanufacturing, or letting others do. So the America First comes in as sort of a benefit. When you mentioned some of the interesting examples that I've seen in the market, and Sean is right, there are some that are in the market. So I went in a couple years ago to a facility in Georgia that was producing soy foam. So they're taking soy protein and turning it into firefighting foam. And I saw the firefighters came from all over the country to test this, and it's amazing. And it has no PFAS, so it reduces environmental impacts, and it's there on the market that can be used now. There are soy lubricants that are made from soy. There are all kinds of, as I mentioned, bio-based cleaners. In fact, when I was at USDA, the BioPreferred program, which voluntarily labels these, had over 10,000 products in the commercial space that are all using bio-based materials and have in them. So that's some examples. I mentioned, when I think about bio-based products, I think of them in three ways. So the ones I've just mentioned then are sort of using the same crop. So we're using the soybean oil, but for an additional purpose. So an additional income stream from the same crop, or the corn from the bioplastics. But we also have, other opportunities, which is using waste from those crops. And I use the term waste in quotes because, let's take almonds. We produce the almonds to eat them, but what about the hulls? And how do we use those? And those can be used for pet food. They can be used for fiber. They can be used for building material. So we have a second stream of income potentially from the waste from the same crop. And then the third thing is, how do we have new biomass crops, or how do we utilize the land for a second crop? And that gets into things like the intermediate oilseed crops that were mentioned in the last panel, carinata or pennycress. We get into things like miscanthus, or we get into hemp. So crops that can be going on marginal lands around the borders of the farms that can also be used for biomass, for building materials. So I think there's unlimited potential here while using the same resources that we already have and are already producing, that farmers are using to produce the crops that they have now.
And I'm glad you brought that up about it. I just met one of the largest hemp growers in the United States that's growing non-THC hemp for building materials last week in Arizona. One of the questions that came in is both for Lindsay and Amy. Lindsay, let's start with you. The opportunity to grow some of the intermediate crops that Greg just mentioned. Is GIVO looking for any specific crop, or are you agnostic about that? Or is diversification part of the game plan?
Yeah, so we're an alcohol-to-jet producer, so we are in that ethanol space. We need starches, carbohydrates, sugars to ferment. But there is an opportunity for where it works, where it makes sense to add cover crops into your rotation. It can impact your CI score in I'll say a negative way, but in a good way. So that's one opportunity in the CI perspective. I think around the world, when we're looking at opportunities for additional jet production, we're looking at, where's the waste suite? What are the other feedstocks that are available around the world? Because so many of the other countries look to us and say, corn is bad. And so There was a question on the earlier panel around food versus fuel, and is that still an issue? That is still an issue. We may all be on the same page and that does not exist, but when you leave this country, it is the first question you often get asked. So we need to continue to educate in that space, but in the meantime, we're looking at other opportunities like those waste streams and waste carbohydrate streams.
Thanks. And Amy, the question for you, actually two here we can combine. You're out in western Kansas, so what about diversification? What's that look like for you?
So I was just visiting with Phil earlier and he asked how things were in western Kansas, and very, very dry. And actually most of the sorghum belt, which is South Dakota to South Texas. And so one thing that, and if you've heard me speak at all, you've heard this before, but my father-in-law, who was the farmer, often says sorghum is the only thing that kept him from losing the entire farm in the 80s. Because it takes less to put in the ground, it takes less to maintain, and it still produces a crop. So in these tight times, I do see a lot of people pushing the pencil, seeing what they can find in the sorghum world, and seeing another question, what are some opportunities, domestics, so on and so forth. And I would say, speaking to what Lindsay said, we have ethanol plants in Kansas that use 100% sorghum. Which oftentimes is either not known or overlooked, but it can be done. Sometimes it's a blend. So I don't know if you've seen the piles of sorghum that I have in western Kansas and all through the sorghum belt, but that's another reason that we need E15, because it will eat up those bushels very quickly. So the question being, what does that look like for transition and people looking at that? We sit on top of the Ogallala Aquifer, so which is declining, and so we're always looking for ways to conserve our water. My farm personally only has one circle of irrigation, so we are 99.9% dry land. So sorghum continues to be the one crop that we can put in the ground with limited water and still produce a crop. And I think we'll see an increase in, especially a conversation being had, what does that look like in this tough economic time?
Greg, you was going to add, and then Sean?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I've seen a lot of different opportunities for producers to grow additional crops beyond corn and soy. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where the company Covercrest was there, and they're using pennycress, and they're working with farmers that will grow it as an intermediate oilseed crop in between their corn and soy rotations. And they've gotten a number of farmers to do it, and they're getting the processing plant to take that pennycress and turn it into biofuels. And so they're moving forward. It's not an easy road. There's issues around crop insurance, and I think the company is self-insuring those farmers because they don't have the data yet for USDA crop insurance. There's issues about the conservation programs, which, don't want cover crops to be harvested. And so, again, moving forward with those kind of things, that's an example. And a second example I'll give is I was at the ABLC conference this past week in Washington, D.C., and, there's a company that's making ethanol from sugarcane in Southern California, right across the border from Mexico. And in this situation, you had a bunch of sugar beet farmers, and the processing plant closed. And so those sugar beet farmers for now are growing hay and losing a lot of money. And instead, they're going to contract with them to grow sugarcane to produce ethanol. And so, in some instances, we're talking about an additional crop on the land, and in some instances, we're talking about actually improving the farmer's income by producing a crop that's going to be more valuable to them given their current circumstances.
Sean?
Yeah, and I'll tee off of what Gregory said and Lindsay. A couple things that I might just bring your attention to as we think about other crops, whether you call them intermediary or novel crops, and Lindsay mentioned the word carbon. Part of the thing that, and this might lead to the next question there, Sarah, but as we think about what is policy and regulatory, both domestically and internationally, why must we be at the table? The reason Brazil is eating our lunch on ethanol is because they take a land use change penalty to one crop but grow two. So what does that do? It makes your second crop look really good, meaning a very low score because there's no land use change penalty to that. So as we look at other crops and diversifying what we do here in the States, we also have to get the math right, as our team spends a lot of time talking and investigating and researching and understanding life cycle assessments of our crops specifically. But how does our corn-soy rotation play into it? How do other crops play into that rotation? And Gregory alluded to the cover crops not being harvested. There is a big difference in USDA regulation of whether the crop is harvested or not. So if a cover crop gets harvested, that changes how USDA perceives that. So from a policy and regulatory side, we have a lot of room to catch up from how are we accounting for this? And that impacts everybody that was on the panel ahead of us as we think about SAF, maritime, ethanol, as well as how do we engage in this bioeconomy. The numbers for our crops used in these models across the world impact whether or not the American crop can remain competitive. No matter what crop that is, it's important that we get it right.
Yeah, did you want to say?
Can I start on the next question around policy?
Go ahead.
Okay. We'll just keep going on this whole thread here around the policy has to be, when you're sitting there and you're writing policy, you have to think about what isn't happening today. So I started my time in this city at EPA, and we were working on the RFS. And it is written in such a way that it's really hard to evolve. It's really hard to get changes made. It's really hard to say, I have this new novel product. I'm doing something really amazing that benefits the environment and benefits the economy. We can't do that with the RFS. Okay. GEVO we have our own CCS well on site. So we are capturing that CO2 off the fermentation from our ethanol plant, sequestering that carbon underground. It is locked in there for 1,000 years. Can we get a pathway that shows that benefit in the RFS? Not today. We're working with the EPA to get that in there so that we can count that, but that's one of the ways that we need to start to think about our policy and how do we evolve our policy. USDA is a similar way. How do we let these farmers and companies do what they need to do without saying, oof, my rules don't apply. I'm sorry, I can't do that. We have to think about how we can evolve and how we can create easier openings for companies to petition for change and then to allow that for use in the future and not always assume that someone is here to commit fraud. We should come back to this space of let's assume noble intent and not assume that somebody's here to just game the system.
I'm going to agree with both Sean and Lindsay and what they said about having enabling policies. I think that is absolutely critical here. And having worked in the government most recently, they are thinking about these things, and I give the staff's credit there. It does take a long time. I would say it's really important that everybody in this room and others come in and talk to both the politicians on the Hill and also the people in the executive branch, because they need to understand these stories. They need to understand what the limitations are. And I would say to all of you, be creative also and propose solutions to them. So, because, I'm a lawyer, and a lot of the lawyers in the government tend to be narrowly focused sometimes and narrow thinking. But if people come in with creative solutions, the government will adopt those and will deal with them. And so I do think you need that. The second thing I would just say is as I mentioned, there were a lot of programs, a lot of things the government does to build the bioeconomy, to build bio-based products and biotech and biomanufacturing, but we don't have an overall strategy. And we haven't really prioritized this, I think, nationally as much as we should, and bring all those partners together. And if we did that, I think some of the things that Lindsay's talking about and Sean are talking about would be easier to deal because they would be seen in a broader policy context, a broader priority. So, we have other priorities in this country that we do, and then we do from the top down really put funds into them and put resources into them and try to then see how they go through the whole economy. I think we need to do that for bioeconomy also.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of discussion about food security, national security. Well, I have these concerns. We talk about it, but developing that strategy that's comprehensive in nature seems to be very much still a work in progress, if that's an optimistic way of looking at it. Amy, from your standpoint, what do you see as one of the biggest things that you'd like the audience or others to do in working with the sorghum industry to push Congress and get the policies in place that can help enhance both sorghum consumption for food as well as in the ethanol space?
I think, really having the farmer at the table. Again, like I said, thank you for allowing me to be that farmer today, because we are talking all of policy, all the things that will influence my farm. And oftentimes we are the last ones to hear about it. Or you want us to adopt this new practice. Well, this new practice is not free. And don't forget, the combine I just purchased to harvest my crops is oftentimes the same price as somebody's forever home. So if you want me to do things differently, let's talk first. I always say, sitting across the table from somebody, you get a lot more done. And there's things that we have to understand differently as farmers. You often hear, I'll say out in Western Kansas, we think y'all just sit in your own bubble and create these things. But oftentimes we're guilty too as the farmers. We sit on our tractors, we sit in Western Kansas, and we are doing what we can do best, and so are you. So when we can make those two things merge, that's when I think true success happens. And unfortunately, oftentimes those don't intersect until we're in bad, dire straits. And so that's the unfortunate thing too. Like John said, we're dependent too much on ad hoc. My husband always says he doesn't want to be a mailbox farmer. He is a farmer. He grows and produces and harvests. That's what he wants to do. And he wants to take his grain to the elevator and have a good price for what he just put his whole year into. And so trying to look at that, that's why these conversations are so important, is the value added is when I can't get a good price, what else do I have to do? And so taking some of these things in our own hands as farmers and producers, I think really, as to what Sean said, in these creative spaces have awarded those that are saying we have a lot of great product. How do we move those? So my number one ask is just understand, have the conversations. I think we do a fairly good job, but having the conversations from the beginning to the end and implementation is the difficulty. Just 45Z, as they were talking about in the earlier panel, we're invested. We're trying to be ready for when we get that green light. So what does that look like? We've done things different the last growing season. We've taken pictures. We've been even better with our data. And now we're sitting here. Now what do we do? And will we actually get money back in my farmer pocket? So again, having conversation from the beginning to the end and implementation being the key part of the end, I think is really important for Congress, for these conversations here today and the representation in the room, very important. And again, appreciate the fact that I can be a farmer. I see Jamie here with wheat, and I'm glad she's here. But just continuing those conversations with the farmers are incredibly important.
Super. And for our other panelists, just a quick take home, 30 seconds or less. If you would like the audience to have one message from your perspective about what we need to do differently to build more value-added demand, what would it be? And Sean, I'm going to start with you.
Well, the easy one is buy a different air filter for your home and change it frequently. But the other part of that is really, you set this up, Amy, a lot of market signals are driven by customer demand. And as we all are customers voting with our pocketbooks, we can ask those that we either work for or are involved with, are you using the products that your customers, most of us involved in ag, if we're a seed company, equipment company, fertilizer company, etc., are we using our customers' products? And if not, what in our supply chain can be changed to support the growers that are helping pave our way for the business? And that's really the easiest, biggest ask. I say easiest with a caveat, knowing that the procurement departments are maybe hard to deal with at times, but it is possible, it's doable. There are things out there that we can do to help drive and reinforce then when we go to policymakers. Consumers want this, we know it works, and we need your help.
Great. Lindsay?
Tell your story and know your numbers. So know what you're doing on your farm, know what impact that has, understand where your CI score is coming from, and go out and tell your story, because not enough people understand what's actually happening. And we hear it day in and day out. Why doesn't someone come tell me that they're actually doing this? They are. So go be another voice to tell your story, and that will layer into the policy. That will give people another opportunity from the buyer's side and the customer side to also tell their story and tell where this value is coming from. That's going to build that voluntary market that helps lift us all.
Greg?
So I may, in some ways, contradict myself a little bit. I've talked a lot about the federal policy, and I do think federal policy is critical to this. But I also just want to mention at the end that local, I mean, in the end, biomass is local, biomanufacturing is local, the jobs are local, the farmers are local. And so you really need a bottoms-up approach here at the same time. You need to have local institutions involved, you need local governments and others, because they're going to build the enabling environment that really allows us to develop these different specialty products, these products made from bio-based materials that are out there. So it's a combination of the national and the local, and we really need those partnerships.